getting so much better with those introductions and everything else too. So anyhow, hello everybody, welcome to the Pixel Classroom podcast here on live stream right here on YouTube, as well as on for our audio listeners today here. And as you can see, I have my guest ready to go here. So let me introduce you to our guest right now here. She is, of course, an associate professor at the at National University, where she serves as a dissertation chair, which I know is not an easy job as somebody who has also finished a dissertation, and as somebody who was a student, I'm sure your job was quite the work there too. So, working on that, she's usually on facility lead for socio-emotional learning and curriculum and instruction. She's also director of NU's Advanced Research Center and editor of the International Journal of Online Graduate Education. I'd like to welcome the one and only Dr. Maggie Broderick to the Pixel Classroom. Maggie, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Ryan. It's great to be here. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog, Charlie. He loves podcasts. So glad to be here with you today.
Yeah, people who do see our live stream do know as once in a while, Willow, my dog likes to walk in here once in a while too. So she'll be like, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" So it's nice to have a fellow dog podcaster on here too.
That's right. Great stuff.
So Maggie, despite my little introduction, I know that doesn't do you justice, but what led you to, of course, heading over to the university? Believe it or not, I have not had very many college teachers and professors on here. Maybe I think with you, I still got one hand left here with a couple fingers left here. That's how rare it is here. But why don't we talk about what brought you to education? What led you to the field, and the fact that it's social emotional, which is a very good area too, especially curriculum instruction. I mean, my doctorate is instructional technology for curriculum instruction, as well as I definitely have to deal a lot with SEL myself since I've switched my last two districts, especially with a lot of ELL students. So why don't you just tell us what that journey led you to today?
Awesome, Ryan. Well, we have so much in common. All of those things you just mentioned are part of my sort of hodgepodge and patchwork quilt of what got me where I am today. I actually started off as a music teacher years ago. I'm a flute player, and I started off teaching elementary general music at a very cool school here in Pittsburgh. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and it is a German magnet school. So the kids there were learning German. I also was certified, in both German and music. So I thought this is, my dream come true to teach there, which I did for almost a decade, and did that for a while. And then I had my three kids. Two are now adults, ages 22 and 18, and one's 13. Teenager, you know how that goes.
Yeah. My son is 13, soon to be 14. Hard to believe it in a month. I can't believe. I mean, we gotta get ready to wrap up here, and he's has his high school interviews in the next couple of months. It's like, what? How did that happen?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So you know how it is. It's a lot, as parents. So I actually discovered online teaching at a certain point and finished my PhD in foreign language teaching, actually. And I said, hey, I could teach online, and that would be great for me as a parent to juggle that, just like a lot of our students these days, right? They're very busy. So I find that I have that in common with them. So got into online teaching with the PhD, and I love it. I love teacher education. I love curriculum work. Like you mentioned, social emotional learning. At National University, I'm one of many who is involved in many of our programs there, and social emotional learning and also curriculum and stuff with English language learners. So you and I have a lot in common with that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it really was. I mean, like I said, it was funny when you first reached out to me and totally put it out to me on the podcast. I was reading what you were, and I was like, well, that's an interesting timing considering what's about the, how I was about to switch from high school to junior high, and I was like going to be in a lot of more of that. So I was like, oh, maybe this is a really perfect time for us to do that too. I mean, I have a larger, Latino Spanish speaking, but they're not just from, Mexico or Spain. They're also, I got some from Honduras. I have several teachers. I have some from Chile. I have a couple from Puerto Rico. My cousins have Puerto Rican. It's very interesting the type of diversity we have, and with the coworkers. I've really had to work with a lot of the coworkers, talking about their culture as well as their own social emotional learning, because some are able to connect very well with the students. Some it's just as difficult as any other teacher would have, whether you have English speaking. Years ago, I had a student, and they spoke French, and it was kind of like, wait a minute, I have no training. I mean, yes, I had an old girlfriend, and she spoke very fluent French. I mean, she even went and taught in Paris for a year. But it's like, well, what do we do here? And we had to really work about that connection and everything, because while they knew English, it was really interesting with the little foreign language barriers that were in place with the lessons. Because even though Translate wasn't as good. I mean, we have stuff like Wordly and stuff like AI stuff, which definitely helps with translation. But back then, the best was Google Translate. Right. And half the time I do it now too, is I copy and paste it into the translator and copy and paste it, make sure it conjugates correctly in the right, masculine or feminine words. And I had to do that with her. And it was like, whoa, I'm in a whole different universe here.
Right. Amazing stuff. We make it work, though. Human beings figure out how to communicate.
Yeah, it is, and on that too, like one of your additions you did really is talk about building scholarly bridges. Guidance with academics, which, like I said, I'll have this on the show notes, as well as Maggie's publications will be on here on the show notes and the audio, and later on the post piece of this too. But what is a big thing about scholarly bridges? I mean, I luckily do know a lot of educators, both in college, online learning. I worked with a couple of students that were like one-to-one little freelance pieces. But what is it about building those scholarly bridges? I learned that in my own dissertation work. I had to reach out to some of these people I put in my dissertation because A, they were still alive, and B, it's like, well, you can't just use the material. Yeah, it might be out there in peer review, but you got to kind of contact like, hey, I'm doing X, Y, and Z. Is it okay? And I didn't. I had a couple of professors like, well, thank you for reaching out. I didn't know I was cool enough to be in another dissertation. I laughed at this.
Yeah.
Because I had a curriculum online teacher in New York, and he was bilingual. I should say he was trilingual. He spoke Spanish, English, and he also spoke German too. It was kind of, I can't think of his name right now, but it was kind of funny. He just like emailed me. He emailed me an hour later saying, "What? Really? You want to use my? Okay, hey, I'm good with that." He's like, "Let me know if you have anything." I was like, "Well, what a nice guy."
That's right. That's right. It's a special kind of cool. I love that you say it's cool. And absolutely, anytime I see my work or my colleagues' work being cited, I love that. And yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the bridges. So I'm from Pittsburgh, like I mentioned, and it's a city of bridges. I think we have the most bridges in any city of America. I don't have a citation for you, but I'm pretty sure it's close to true or true.
My one sister-in-law grew up in Pittsburgh most of her life, so I think Michelle could probably vouch for
We'll,
you. Probably.
we'll get a citation. We'll say Michelle 2024. Absolutely, absolutely love
Could
it.
you
But
confirm
yeah,
what
so
Broderick said? Dr. Broderick wants confirmation.
I love it. But that made me think a lot about how important it is to build those bridges. And it's pretty deep. It is exactly what you said, and other things as well, bridging to the past and to the future. And so that actually was a chapter that I wrote pretty recently to go along with an open educational resource that I wrote. So I kind of did them almost like twins the same time because I had a lot to say about it. So the bridges chapter that I wrote is about sort of our advanced research center at National University and how we help people, usually doctoral students, but often faculty, staff, and alumni, as they work to do that next step, that bridge from the doctorate or from their current role to publish and present. So to be at a conference and have that peer review process, or to write a book chapter or a scholarly journal article, anything like this, and to find people to do it with, because it can be kind of daunting and lonely and scary. So I did write that Building Bridges chapter, and then also an open educational research called Servant Scholarship, and it's
Hmm,
called Weaving a Lasting Tapestry. So it's the yarn, just like you mentioned up there.
right.
Love that. So I love my bridges, I love my yarn, and the idea that we are weaving over time with people. I mean, I love Vygotsky, for example, and my social cultural learning type of thing. All these sorts of things with how people scaffold student learning and children and all of this. And so I think about that and I think, gosh, my name is somewhere with Vygotsky somewhere, and it's like you said, it's almost a starstruck thing because I'm thinking about Vygotsky's work from the past. Somebody in the future, maybe I'll be gone, and maybe they will think about my work, and that's a really wonderful thing. So I think about those bridges, and I think about weaving that lasting tapestry with that.
Yeah, and people who are on the live stream here in the viewer playback can actually see I just brought it up right here with the abstract with the OER right here, piece too. So it's like you can see that. But yeah, it's really good. I always like that too. Like, would you like to accept this? I'm like, well, yeah, I'm kind of trying to show it right now. Of course I'm going to do it with Dr. Broderick right here. I know, and it's kind of funny when you were talking about that because, like I said, I defended my dissertation in January 22nd of 2020. And we got approved, and of course, after everything happened with shutdown, I had to get my pieces and my edits and everything was sent out. What's kind of funny is I actually, and as we joke later with my thing, I actually got a couple of downloads in the summer of 2020 about research for some high schools and some other elementary, because I had talked about mobile and online learning and how that worked with PD and how to design it. So it was funny. I got an email from a school that said, "Oh, Dr. Reed, it is Dr. Reed, right?" I'm like, "Yeah." I said, supposedly I got confirmed as a doctor. They say, "Well, we want to lose it. We're working on some online learning. I know you talked about Google Classroom and that a lot." I'm like, "Oh yeah, go right ahead. Like, be more than happy." I said, and I had a teacher blog open at the time, so I said, "Yeah, you want any research or some other context?" But it was kind of cool doing that little scholarly insects. And some follow me here on the podcast, and some follow my more professional networks on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. So it's kind of cool about how that worked, about, like I said, weaving it all together. And I got some ideas from their school district, like, "Oh, I should research this school district. We're kind of in a similar situation. Let me say, oh," I'm like, "Oh, I never thought about about that. And it's funny because in my current school district, we use Clever a lot. We didn't use it in one of mine two back during COVID, learning online. And it's very interesting how how they had theirs set up so nicely. And we had like this very basic. And then here I am at my current district at CS 50, and it's so nicely organized. They have the pages and stuff. And it was kind of cool. And they're like, "Oh, you're doing really well with Clever." It's like, well, I had some, previous districts that reached out to me. So it was kind of nice to kind of seamlessly come into it as well and be like, oh, then the students know how to do it. So it was nice to weave that in. And if they got stuck, I was able to jump in on it too. So it was kind of nice to bring
Nice.
those connections with that there too.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, one thing we definitely talk about is somebody here, and I had Anna Nick Roch on my last podcast, and we were talking about phenomenal over there too, but we're really talking about social emotional learning, which I think is very, and I have to say, in my current district too, I really had to really look at that social emotion, especially in the middle school, because I mean, I have 11 through 14-year-olds. I have not been in middle school in almost 8 years. So that was the thing, but I had to think it's a different emotional supports for a lot of these students, especially when you have ELL students, but it's amazing what you have to, why is SEL, like, I think becoming more prominent right now, not only just in the elementary, I should say in the student life, but more for us as teachers, but it's also becoming more common in college. I know I went through some issues, somebody who's dealt with his depression a lot. There was not a lot of SEL back to my undergraduate. I saw more of it during my master's degree, especially when I was trying to finish that. And I was unemployed at the time with a brand new baby and a wife at home.
Oh,
So
wow, yeah.
it was luckily I had that support, but I said to myself, this would have been 10 years earlier, that support wouldn't have been around. And it's like, where does it really come from for the social emotional lesson for SEL, especially as we move on to that higher level, like in college and I should say post high school life.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head that it's for everybody. It's human, literally everyone. I've taught people from the age of say 3, preschool music lessons with children dancing around in a circle and singing, all the way up to online learners I had one in her 80s. I had a lovely student who was in her 80s. She disclosed her age to me. I was like, wow, that's awesome. And everything in between. And you're exactly right. When we think about SEL, it's for everyone. And I think that in our American culture in particular, and other cultures in the world, but particularly here in the US, we've very traditionally had this thing where you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right?
Mhm.
Pioneering kind of self-determination can be good and bad. It's a double-edged sword, right? It can be
Right.
good. It also can be harmful and can actually cause some distress and some difficulties for us and can cause relationship things. So I do think that if we think about empathy and human understanding, and intrapersonal a lot more than we usually do, and don't just say, oh, just grit your teeth and bear it, but try to actually see people through things, they can have a much richer and better learning experience that feels, wonderful, as opposed to sort of I did it despite the situation, right? In spite of all the which is an accomplishment.
Yeah.
I pulled myself up. That's great. And believe me, I've been there. But to have that feeling that you were supported all the way. I'll disclose, recently my mom passed away about
Mm.
7 weeks ago, sort of suddenly. It's been very difficult. And I have some important responsibilities that I do for work. But to have the people around me, my boss and other people and colleagues kind of wrap around and have that empathy made me able to do better at my work, even when I had to take a little time off and everything, because I did feel like it was human. I didn't feel like, oh, I
Mhm.
just got to get this despite the stress, despite the sadness, despite whatever. It felt like I'm going to do this, while it's happening because, that space was made for me as a human being.
Yeah, and I think that's very important. My cousin passed away. I mean, first of all, I'm sorry about your mom. I mean, my own mom's been through cancer herself, and she's also had a stroke a couple years ago. So I
Oh,
mean,
I'm
she's
so sorry.
doing very well. It's 72, and I was just actually talking to her. I like that's one thing that's been nice about switching to the cold district. When I commute this long, I like to call her up almost every day just to see how she is.
Oh,
It's just been
yeah.
a thing of ours for a long time. Um, but it's a thing because, like I said, I had my cousin pass away. She lost a battle with lymphoma cancer herself too, and it's hard to believe this December will be. Wow, it's hard to believe it's going to be almost 6 years. I can't believe it's been that long since she's been gone, and I have a little thing in my classroom, and I always say like, "Oh, what is it? Oh, it's my husky. That's Gina." And they're like, "Oh," and I said, "That's 22. That was my cousin. It's number." And that
Oh,
was her thing. And she played NIU basketball, and I said, "So that's." I said, "That's Gina right there too." But it
oh,
was nice when I was working because I was barely there 2 years at my previous district at that time. But it was also good that they were able to say, "Hey, you need some time off. You're doing with a lot. Your cousin just passed away. Your mother's going through cancer." It's like, and I said, "Yeah, I think I did." And it was good to be able to have that have that ability that they understood that. And
That's right.
I've
That's
been in
right.
districts where that's not always the case. Like like when it's something like what just happened to you, yeah, they're like, oh yeah, we're sorry, hey, you got to take time. That's a parent, we understand. And I've been ones where it's like, my wife had brain surgery, had everything else. There was definitely a time on it, but there was also a situation where it was like there wasn't as much, I couldn't say compassion, but there definitely wasn't a lot of support on the aftermath of that. I mean, it was a thing and she came through it, but the aftermath, I don't think anybody understood it. And we had, Melissa did herself too, and she showed pictures of her surgery post and no hair, giant scar, and people were like shocked. And it was like, then there was an outpour, but at the same time, it was like you're aware of what was going on. You were saying, "Ting, I don't know why it had to take pictures to do it," versus like, "Hey, my cousin passed away a few years ago." Everybody immediately was like, "Oh, nope, understood. Take time off. You were very close. You lived
That's
the
right.
big thing." And it is, and I think it's sometimes people do that, and that does hurt them too in work environment where it's like, well, so if something happened to me, you know what? Here, I mean, there was a story, sad to say, a couple years ago. This is a true story. There was an athletics co-director, and wasn't the best, and they were definitely saying, hey, I don't think we're going to renew his contract. He had, unfortunately, a heart attack out of nowhere in the
Oh,
office.
goodness.
Got the thing, survived, was okay, and then they told him 2 days later in the hospital he was fired. It was like,
Oh my
why
goodness.
would you do
Goodness.
that? And he, like, what was he? I mean, luckily things good. He's recovered, and from my understanding, he's moved on to a better whatever he was in that. But I was just like, how could you do that? It's like, wait, and I'm like, you're talking to a guy who a week before school said like, hey, we're cutting the budget. You're out of a job September 11th. I was like, well, wait, what?
Mhm,
I was like, wait,
mhm.
what?
Yeah,
It was kind of like
yeah.
there was a main versus like, well, we'll get this, you'll get your pay, and we'll give you time. But I'm like, yeah, I would have rather been happy if you had told me back in May that you were going to cut my position. I had time. Like it's late August. It's like there's not going to be a lot of positions looking for me for a new job.
Oof.
In my
Yep.
last district, they sent us all in January, which was both a good and a bad thing because okay, they were thought in their heads, oh, it's January, you got so much time, you got months to find a new job, and you're still paid. But then it's on your shoulder saying like, I'm not going to have a job in 5 months, and you're expecting me to go in every single day and then act like nothing's going on. It's like
Right.
that,
Yeah, the
that
human
doesn't help.
element. We really have to put ourselves in each other's shoes, right? Whether they're kids or adults, and true for teachers too, right? We have to think about that. We can't just ask the emotion labor of the teachers and not give
Mhm.
them what they need, right?
Yeah, and I think that's always a problem. I mean, it's one thing where it's like, well, we need this support, but sometimes it's very emotional. Sometimes you want to feel support. I mean, I, especially me here, I have a very supportive staff. It's not perfect, but it's good that I can email or call somebody right away and get an instant report. Maybe it's not like snap, like, hey, I got a situation right now, and I really need, so and so in this room right now to handle a situation. But it's good to feel like, hey, how are you doing? Or like, oh, talk like. I had a write up a couple days ago and everything, and I showed right up in my assistant principal. He's like, "Oh, I was just about to call." He's like, "Well, I figured you were going to ask me about the whole event so we get it all." Okay. He's like, "Well, that's good." I'm like, "Well, I understand what your job is. You understand what my job is. So don't be shocked." I came in and say, "Hey, I know what we got to do, and let's do it." Because sometimes, believe it or not, administrators need that too. Everybody always says like, "Oh, the administrators
Yes.
got to do this and got everything." Sometimes they need a support when they have a staff member is really like, "Hey, I know we got to do this. I'm here. Let's talk." It's kind of like, whoa, I think it did shock him. I mean, he was happy about it, but he was like a little shocked that I,
They're
as a
people too.
newer employee, coming in like that.
They're people too. You're 100% right. And, even the dean of a university or anything like this, probably every level, everybody's a human too. They just maybe have to, put that aside once in a while they're getting things done, but then understand that's still a human being behind. Even if they're getting business done today, sure, that's great. Inside of them is also this human being just like you.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, we're all human. Even people have we've had it, issues or no problem, but there is something very human about all of us. It's trying to understand the other side. I mean, I think if I'm looking over one of your things, because you were talking right here, like navigating the school as a smaller fish, research based on guidance to teacher of less commonly taught content areas. I mean, I'm in a robotics technology class now. I was a CT business teacher for the last 8 years, but I taught computer science. I taught multimedia 1 and 2. I taught marketing. I taught business law for the first time, which, believe it or not, I really loved doing it, which was funny. I always had a thing for consumer and law and everything else too. But there's people like here, like if I talk, and if she's listening to this, she's probably going to yell at me the next day here. But one of my coworkers, I mean, she's the main STEM teacher. And one thing we got to do is not step on each other's toes. There's very similarities, but when we have to look at what are your standards and stuff, there's not really standards for a
Right.
full STEM class.
Right.
There's things that encompass it, but I think what one of our meetings, she said herself, like, I got to find something. Like me, it's like, okay, I'll find this. I can use ISTE. I can use this for this because of how I'm going to assess the student. This is how I'm going to do it with a CTE, a career in technology education, because that standard exists. But then you have people have these content areas. I know there was a teacher I worked with. She just taught Genius Hour. That's all she taught for 3
Mm.
years.
Mm.
And why there's many concepts, and I've had Don Wedtrick on here and other people. What are the content standards for Genius Art that don't exist? But there are other classes. Like I was in a school, and they said, oh yeah, we do a kind of a library, multimedia, and then we do it with drone units. And I was like,
Yeah.
what are you using? They're like, oh, I don't know. We're only school in 60 miles that does this. It's kind of like, what do you do? They don't have anything, and the board loves it, the students love it, but at the same time, it's like, well, how do we evaluate? How do we get you positive? You've got such a small niche. It's like, what do we do?
Right. I mean, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought up sort of that feeling of being the smaller fish. Like I said, I was a music teacher, and I've found that these special spaces, like you say, that maybe this incredibly niche topic class that is exactly what one kid needs, it's a really wonderful pocket where social emotional things can bloom. And that's sort of the focus of what I'm going to do next with a book chapter I'm working on currently. It's based on this idea of the less commonly taught content areas. And I got that idea because for languages, they were phrasing that some organizations for, foreign language education for the less commonly taught languages, right? We hear about
Mhm.
Spanish, French, things that are more commonly taught in the US in particular. And then what was less commonly taught, like, I don't know, Dutch or
Or
something like this,
Italian. Italian
Tagalog
was
or
a huge things from the 50s to the early 70s. But it kind of vanished away. But at the time, at those decades, it made sense that somebody would need to learn like German or Italian, especially post World War II or post Korea. It made sense. I think there was a school where they taught them how to do Korean. It was so niche, but they had such a populace, it was kind of needed at that time. And I
yeah.
think this was, believe it, in northern Washington at the time too.
You got it. Right, exactly. So that idea that something is, you don't really have colleagues per se. Let's say it's in your school. So if you are the teacher of some very niche thing, but then the students gravitate towards you very often, especially if you're very good at it and passionate about it. So just thinking about, for example, my son with visual art, the wing of the high school, which was a huge comprehensive high school in the city here, that had art. He would just go up there. It just felt like the right place for him to be. And then some other things came up where that was just the place where he could bloom. And they're like, well, here, you can have your lunch in this room. You can hang out here in the art room. Same thing with sometimes music and with my daughter with an engineering magnet, totally different kind of situation. But she really was able to have that space in that kind of a, you know, niche area. But then are those teachers supported the way they need? Because like you said, they don't always have the same foundations of organizations and things behind them. They may have to kind of go rogue in a way and come up with something
Right.
new. So my friend who's a Russian teacher has spoken about this, and he's disclosed that he's one of the people in the chapter, and he's mentioned this because teaching Russian is very niche. And what is the
Mhm.
culture that he's built around this whole thing with the students who say, I'm going to take Russian, and he's like, yeah, cool. And then they have a whole sort of almost a family, I would
Mhm.
say, because it continues along and you teach those students for a long time. So then you can get to know them really as human beings, and that social emotional part comes in. I think I want to see a lot more about those stories.
Yeah, I had a coworker years ago, and I, like I said, he went to Northern like me too, but they had a niche class which was taught, which was Hebrew, and of course he was Jewish, and he had that, but he knew it very well. He grew up that way, so he really knew a lot of the Hebrew language. So what he was doing is, when he came in, he got advanced learning. They created groups because, like, hey, listen to him because he's got things. So they were able to work on that niche, and it still exists. The professor is still there, but that really created thing because that's not something a lot of people came in like, oh yeah, I'm going to take Hebrew. It's like it was really, and I remember those days too. And I remember seeing it like, really? I'm like, yeah, I got a large Jewish side of my family, but that's not a class. I like, how would that function? I remember that I took a black theater history, and it was only taught every 2-3 years. And the professor who taught it only taught it every two. There was only 3 of us in that class,
Yeah.
but it was such an enrichment. And we got to go to some of the theaters in Chicago for a couple things, and it was just so enrichment. But it was how that developed. But he said himself too, like the previous 2 years before, he had a class of 15, and here we were 3. And then just before he left, he had one more year of it. He had a class of 20. But the
Mhm.
class went up and down so many times. So like I said, it was only done every 2 years, and I thought it was so unique. And I wanted to take. I was just not expecting to be three of us. I thought, oh, there's probably gonna be like 10, 12 of us. Maybe not a huge class, but small. And here it was three. But we were able to get more culturally involved into it. The work here, we really got to see the Black theater history of it. Not only the culture, but how it really fit in and like where it did from the days of history and actually where it came from. Because the truth was, there was no true origin of it. It came from different cultures and stuff of Black theater history. So you had something from England, you had something from Asia or Russia, you had something from Africa, and you had some things from, the territories in Canada that brought this together,
Mhm.
eventually formed its own theater history over the course of a good 900 years. And then they're even talking about tribal culture in Africa, how it influenced. It was such a wow, I'm
Yeah.
experiencing it, but it's bigger than I thought. I thought it was like, oh, we're gonna hear about the first ones, freedom, emancipation, blah blah, blah. And it was like, whoa, this is completely different. It blew me away
Awesome.
too.
Yeah, it was a special like thing that's more memorable maybe. You'll learn skills in these other classes that everybody takes, but something very niche like that can sometimes be incredibly special and life-changing. And then the friends that you make in the community you make and the teachers you work with there. So I really want to see more about that and sort of how these things operate. And particularly when I think about students maybe who have a lack of a sense of belonging for whatever other reason, maybe LGBTQIA plus individuals, maybe people who
Mhm.
are a minority in their situation, and then they flock to this special space in the school. What's happening there? What's the social emotional aspect of that that is making that beautiful space that's nurturing for them as a person?
Yeah, and I agree with that too. I mean, one thing all my students who've been in those areas and stuff, they always said my classroom was always inviting, even if maybe not all the students were as inviting. They always said they always felt I was inviting to the as a safe space for that too.
Yes.
And I've always done that. And I've worked with college. Like I said, like I said, some of my first jobs, I was one in a private school, one in a charter school. The private school, I like, as I said, I even said years later, I was very spoiled. I mean, not everybody was perfect in the school. They were still cheating, whatever, and so forth, niches and cliques. But then I went to the charter school, and then I had kids from all over where it's like, hey, they have a nice house like me, to some like they don't know if they had a bed at night. And it was
Yes.
just the change of
Yes.
culture and even the parents. And it was just like, whoa. I was like, I think, as I said, I kind of got thrown into those stories or those movies you saw. And then, like I said, I worked a weekend working in one in Chicago, and all of a sudden I felt like, not to throw it, I felt like it was, Lean on Me all of a sudden. I was waiting for
Mhm.
Morgan Freeman to come out the way I felt at that
Sure.
school. But it was interesting. Like I turned one corner and the kids were great, and I turned the other corner. I was like, oh, okay, these are the horror stories as teachers we hear about. But it was good what they all felt like they could be who they were. They weren't all perfect, but there was a lot of ones that were looking for those fit ins, either whether they were high or low end of that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And just the idea that, we can think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like you said, some
Mhm.
people don't have the things they need that are very basic needs. If we can meet those needs, make sure everybody has what they need when they're there, people are fed and all of this, and then work on those higher needs through this sort of social emotional learning piece. Very often that does happen in these special spaces. I often think of music and art that way, but a lot of places, maybe a sport, maybe something like that could be that for a person. So yeah, very, very important stuff to think about.
Yeah, and then going into that too, as we segue towards the next part over here, like I've got your resources pages here, and I was going over your resources at ARCS here, which was a really interesting little piece, and hopefully it'll jump back on here in a second. Yep, there it goes. I'll go ahead and share that with the live stream viewers here, so I can get that down with the resources. There. There we go. There we go. So,
Yes.
what was the research here with ARCS? I mean, ARCS, like I said, is advanced research. I mean, I know it. I've been through those. Let me get that so we're a little better on screen. There we go. That looks better. People in the live stream, the people who listen to the audio, I just switched us so that way Maggie and I are not like on the side pushing in here. I'm still getting used to my restream, but it's stuff here. But like, how do this? And you put this as one of your projects coming up. But so, what is the thing on the ARC here for the ARC Center pieces for the alumni students and stuff for the university, and what you can use it for?
Sure. Well, you can see my bridge right there, right? So the
Mhm.
same
Yep, there's
idea
the bridge.
with that Pittsburgh bridge kind of idea that we are there to support people. So in my role at National, I'm, like I said, dissertation chair, faculty member, and faculty lead for a lot of things for social emotional learning and curriculum and teaching. But one of my other hats is this, advanced research center. And so what we do is we just connect people. We have scholarly mixers for the people at National in our community, scholarly, just sort of breakout rooms where people in the Zoom can find someone else to present and publish with. So I think it's a neat idea. If you're thinking that you're feeling a little alone and you're part of our national university community, hey, I'd like to do some research or publish or present about, I don't know, a topic like AI or something, important, but how do I find someone to do that with? So we facilitate that and then help people try to find a good avenue. Very often what happens is people say, well, where do I publish or present? And they'll Google it and they'll find something very predatory, like, oh, how about you go on a trip to Cancun and
Right.
we will accept your proposal and we won't peer review you. Well, those are some red flags, right? So
Mhm.
we're there to sort of guide them to find a good place that would be successful for them. Hopefully they'll, it's something that's scholarly peer reviewed and that we will guide them toward the right, submission process, because it's a lot of work you put into publishing and presenting, and then maybe someone to do it with if they'd like to do that, and not totally go it alone.
Yeah, and I said that sort of thing. I mean, somebody who's self-published two of his own books, even though they were, stories, and one was a children's book. I've been part of other scholaries as well as part of other book publications, and it's nice to have that to guide you, because sometimes you don't know what you do. Sometimes it's as simple as like, hey, we want you to contribute a chapter. You do everything. They go over, you have the edit, and then they handle all the hard work. And then there's some times where it's like, I really have a feel for this. I really have a thing. I have the background for it. I'd like to do it. How do I do it? And there's what I mean, right here, you got a lot of things from lifelong learners to accomplishments, as simple as building a curriculum vitae and a resume, something I became more an expert on a couple years ago from a seminar I went through with a couple of ones, which I'm part of with a publication. I think it's coming out later next year. But it's some of these things. It's like some people don't realize that there's some simple things here and there's some very advanced ones, but there is people that are looking for that. I think you mentioned AI is going to be the talk for, I think, the next couple of years.
Yes,
Just like
yeah,
VR and AR came back in a couple of years ago. I know I worked some things with the merge queues as well as some of the other things, I mean, between the Oculuses and other VR systems, which have kind
right.
of come back, but now it's kind of gone side. It's there. It's still very powerful. But I think AI is going to be a huge one. I know some people have been talking more about gesture theory now about using controls. I mean, once you get past the AI and you get it's like what happens, where it is more like Star Trek, like I'm way over here, but I'm doing
Wow.
this, operating a drone with my hands, not okay, command C, get up my phone, okay, take a picture, more of like that gesture theory. And there was a professor a few years ago and he was showing us how to do some of the VR hand with a sensor bar where we were playing a piano, but it was on the screen, but all the thing it was a big light. And we were like, whoa. And gesture theory was something I'd heard about, but it was because my wife took sign language. That's a very
Oh,
big
neat.
thing.
Yeah.
And I have a good friend of mine, his wife, they know sign language like nobody's business. His brother was born without ability to hear. But he said himself, like, it's not just knowing how to do sign language, it's how you gesture it, how do you move it? Because there's a difference between I'm doing this fast and I'm angry and upset versus like, let's
Ah,
quietly talk. But it's like, it's not only how your face reads it, but how your hands move it. And I mean, Sesame Street, hard to
yeah.
believe, was a very big pioneer of that through the 70s and 80s with Linda and Masala, who were the deaf characters on those shows.
Yeah, it's almost like tone of voice, when you're saying the same words. So you make me think about that too when we're teaching online. Text when you're reading it in a discussion board, conveys a certain way, but when you're face to face, maybe on a Zoom or something, you get more of that social emotional piece. So yeah, it's fascinating to think about AI right now and tech and where we're at and where we're going and sort of the human element of that and what's going to be on the horizon, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean that's company. I mean, I've done too. I know my current district too. We're talking about. I use my thing with Magic School. I've used Chat GPT and I use Canva a lot. There's a lot of fantastic Canva AIs out there that can really do it for the students. But there are a couple too. It's like how to properly use it for their materials versus I just want to write my paper. I'm like, you don't want to just say write your paper because believe it or not, despite things we can tell, if you wrote a
That's
paper
right.
in
That's
AI,
right.
it's thick. It's like one of my favorite thing that was a big thing in the early 2000s, which was in Spider Girl when they said, "Come on, man, we're gonna go out for non-fat smoothies." Like I got a wider paper. Like, hey, I googled my paper. I'm good to go. And it's like, but Davita,
Oh,
did you put your citations? And she was like, wait, what?
oh no.
But
Exactly.
that was a perfect thing too, because like I did it. I remember a couple years ago, I looked at something and I said, "You didn't write that." I'm like, what do you mean? Like, no, you did not write that. It's like, what? It's like, what do you mean I didn't write? It's like you use consensus. You don't. Do you even know what that word means? And they looked at me like, I did. I'm like, yeah, you
Uh,
didn't write that paper. It's like me. I was doing things like, could you edit, this letter I want to send out for this school district for a job I'm applying for. I'm reading them like, yep, go. And then also I went, I would never say that sentence in my life. That's not
right.
like no. I'm like I might have a doctorate. I'm not that kind of intellect. I'm like
Oh.
Frasier wouldn't say that on Cheers.
Oh my goodness. Yep.
So what else do you have coming down? You talked about your other book that you got coming up in the publication. What other things do you have coming up on the bend yourself here right now, Maggie? That some of our listeners probably might want to check out here as a research and say like, oh, I think I want to learn a little bit more about Dr. Broderick. I want to see what she's got coming up here.
Oh, well, thanks so much. Well, I'm partnering with some folks. I can't believe it's already November. In about 2 weeks, we're going to be presenting at a conference in Disney World, which is absolutely one of my favorite places on the planet. So we're going to be down there in Orlando, and we're going to present about sort of the power of choice.
Mm.
So in Tomlinson's work in PK through 12, like we
Oh
talk a
yeah,
lot
yeah,
about
yeah.
differentiation, right? We don't talk about it as much in higher ed, and that's unfortunate. We really should. And so we're talking about that, and particularly with the lens of higher ed, maybe even graduate students who have special needs and you might not even realize. And there are different laws and different ways of disclosing and just different things to think about in higher ed. So my colleagues, Dr. St. Louis and Dr. Davis and I are going to go down to Orlando in a couple weeks and talk about that. We're also going to talk about some other things. In Orlando, I have another group I'm presenting with, the curriculum director, Dr. Brian Enfinger, and my colleague, Dr. Gary Walker Roberts, and a bunch of the librarians are going to talk about open educational resources and our journey that we've had at National University. So those are my things that are happening in 2 weeks. So I'm very excited, and that they're going to also be in one of the happiest places on earth. So
Yeah, and I think you brought up a great point with about people don't think about K2. Some do go and say, no, I'm going junior college, or I'm going straight university, and they don't think about the K through 12. I mean, the practice they get there to some point. I think somebody I worked with, he ended up doing he was an electrician and it was a family owned company, but he still taught at the local community college about a couple things. And he said himself, like, it's so funny when I was getting the ability to do this, I had somebody that was coming right out of high school. And he was kind of surprised. I didn't know what to do. I was expecting him to come into this and know this and not do it. And he's like, I wish I would have known more K through 12 curriculum. He's like, for me, I just remember when my kids were still in school. And he said that was 5 years ago. I didn't think about that. And they don't think about that too. I had to teach a couple of undergraduate students several years ago with Dr. York, and some of them, they were in their final, pre-service, so they're getting ready to get certified. But I had an 18-year-old coming right out, new major, who had special ed and was looking at STEM schools. And at that time, I was a STEM. But then they said, he's like, just so you know, I have ADHD. And they said, oh, I said, what kind? And I said, my own son has a very low level himself, but he's still young. We don't know how it's going to be. She's like, if I blank out, I might not know what you said 2 minutes ago. And I was like, oh, I got to think about this, because I was thinking like, and I had to go back to K through 12 to think of something that would work for somebody who is now, post 12. It was like, yikes. Yep. I mean, sweet woman, good friends, really liked her. Missy, if you're out there hitting it, nice that this is who we're talking about. But at the same time, it was kind of like, what do I do? It's like, it wasn't something I was prepped for. I was thinking, oh, this is college level, and these are pre-service teachers. I know what I'm doing. And it's like, no, I don't.
Right, and we want to model for them, specifically in teacher education, but I would say in anything in higher ed, but particularly in teacher ed, we would like to model differentiation. If we're not walking the walk, how can we talk the talk? We're going to tell them to differentiate, but sorry, we're not doing it for you. That's very unfortunate and not as respectful to them as they might want to be towards their learners. So we would hope to, show them, hey, here are some different ways to master these outcomes. You could present it this way, write it this way, do it this way, as long as you're showing outcome mastery for the curriculum. Same thing for your own students. And then the whole circle of teacher education is correct, I think, when we model and walk the walk and talk the talk,
Yeah, and I think that's perfect, because one thing we've been talking about the whole thing about different trends as well as evolution within those areas from that too. I mean, we've talked a lot about for college, but yeah, how much K through 12 does plug into all that, especially with needs and niches for things like that.
Yep, exactly.
Well, Maggie, this has been it's honestly, it's hard to believe it. I mean, here we are, 40 minutes. It's amazing how much this has gone down. So how can people get a hold of you besides, clicking it on LinkedIn or anything else, or what other books they can look into? I'm trying to switch over to your contact information.
Sure. Yeah, LinkedIn is great. And then I'm also on ResearchGate, which some people may know is sort of like the Facebook for researchers.
Yeah.
I always try to tell people to go over there because people update all the time. And if you kind of like to, I don't know, geek out on things, I love it. It's very, very sort of current, what your current, favorite researcher is looking at. So I'm on there. And people can also feel free to just email me at National University. It's mbroderick@nu.edu.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully a lot of people. Yeah, ResearchGate. I didn't even think of her. It's been so. I was on there a while ago looking over some things too, and I haven't been on. So I think I need to reconnect. See what you're doing to me, Maggie. I have to go now. Go back to ResearchGate. You've pulled me back over to that other social media when I just got my things so cut down nicely.
Something to do this weekend, Ryan, for sure.
Yeah, probably is. I mean, like I said, between the down and that, it's like tomorrow. It's like I'm getting ready for the last couple of weeks with my trimester ending before I get new students. It's like, yeah, there we go, a little something new to go in there, maybe pop it in there too. So, well,
Nice.
thank you so much for being on here. Like I said, getting everything else, reaching out beyond the podcast. I mean, it's been a great time, and then people who are listening to on this too. This will be of course available. Of course, you can join our Patreon page at the Pixel Classroom if you want to do it for any tiers or anything. There are also some lessons. I'm just going to tell everybody else, expect some new lessons and tutorials there in December for some people. But I know I don't have any full paid members, but some of the tutorials on there, they will be getting updated at the end of the year for 2025. It's just I've been so busy, as Maggie knows, we get very busy very on time. So I'll have some new ones there, but definitely think if you want to hear episodes here a week early before they go live and everything else. Otherwise, on that, I want to thank you again for Dr. Broderick for being on the Pixel Classroom podcast today.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
It
Thanks for
has.
having me.
And on that note, everybody, we'll see you later.